You're right all. Thanks for clicking onto this video. I hope you'll enjoy it. After completing my through hike of the Southwest Coastal Path in September of 2021, I began writing an account of my journey that started as just a few little stories for friends and family, but eventually grew into something resembling a book. I grew up in the West Country, and I've always been quite surprised by the fact that so many people know so little about what is one of the most beautiful, vibrant and exciting regions of the UK. So I thought I'd use this account of my own journey as an opportunity to introduce future through hikers and anyone else who's interested, of course, to the region that the Coastal Path runs through. Anyway, if you're listening, I hope that you find it useful and interesting. If you do, please like and subscribe, as I'll be writing the later chapters as I go, and I'll be posting a new video every 1 or 2 weeks, so you don't want to miss them. So, without further ado, here's part 1, Lockdown in Abu Dhabi. By the spring of 2020, I'd been teaching in the UAE for the best part of 8 years, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd done any serious hiking. I'd grown up in the English countryside, so walking had always been a part of my life, whether it be Sunday walks around town or trips to the local woodland to walk the dog. Over the years, though, it had gradually turned from an incidental activity to an enjoyable pastime to a semi-serious commitment, and I graduated from day hikes to multi-day trips. I got into it for various reasons, but mostly because it was something I was able to do and able to do reasonably well. I'd never been athletic growing up, and there wasn't a lot of spare cash to spend on more expensive hobbies, but I owned a decent pair of shoes and I could put one foot in front of the other. I might have been horrible at team sports, but I could walk up a hill and crappy weather never bothered me. At the start, it was really just a way to get off the couch and do, well, something. However, I very quickly learned something all hikers eventually do. Nature heals. I know. Saying that makes me come across as an impossibly pretentious mung bean eating star child, but it's true. Nature's got its own energy, and the longer you spend out in it, the more it seeps into you and the more it sets you right. You can't be stressed out at the summit of a steep hill, and depression takes a back seat when you're surrounded by natural beauty. On top of which, it's pretty much impossible for your inner critic to sound credible after you've just walked 15 miles over rough ground without quitting. There's a reason that casualties returning from World War I retreated into nature to heal themselves, and why ecotherapy is such a popular approach to psychotherapy today, because the outdoors connects us to each other and to ourselves in a way that very few things do. Hiking gave me a sense of an achievement, an activity I could enjoy and an excuse to get off the couch when entropy took hold. It also gave me an excuse to see some bits of the world I didn't think I ever would. Back in the mid to late noughties, there were more than a few companies organising sponsored charity treks to some of the more exotic and exciting locations around the world. So, I took full advantage and signed up for treks around Peru and Iceland. Once that was done, a friend and I decided to take on the 3 Peaks Cycle Challenge back in the UK. Then, well, I got a job in Abu Dhabi, and everything changed. For a young-ish Western expat, living in Abu Dhabi is a bit like living in a theme park designed exclusively for rootless adults. The whole place is a big, loud, shiny example of opulence, ostentatiousness and indulgence. Despite legal restrictions against Muslims drinking alcohol, the beer there is cheap and plentiful. 5-star hotels are on every corner and the paychecks are incredibly generous. Plus, you're provided with an apartment you couldn't afford in a month of Sundays back home, and you've got enough free time to enjoy it all. So, I'd done what most of us do when we arrive. I dived headlong into a life of drunken Friday brunches, weekends by the pool and nights out on the piss, and in the process became so utterly hypnotised by it all that the outdoors just seemed, I don't know, not less exciting but less necessary. I found that I needed it less. Suddenly I found myself able to access other pastimes, other ways to distress, other things to enjoy, and my connection to the outdoors just sort of dwindled. I hadn't completely abandoned it. Whenever I went back to the UK, I'd go on day hikes where I could. I also spent a fair few Friday mornings kayaking through the Eastern Mangroves National Park, at least until they chose to build a motorway bridge over it, and more than a few weekends camping in the desert. These were few and far between though, and before I knew it, almost a full decade had passed since the last time I'd done a big hike, an overnighter, or even a particularly challenging day hike. Then of course, COVID came along, and going outdoors wasn't an option anymore. I can't speak to how lockdown was in the UK or the US or anywhere else, but in Abu Dhabi it was necessarily strict. At the start, you were allowed up to 1 hour a day outside of the house to buy food and medicine and nothing else. Going out after 6 p.m. was illegal unless you had a specific travel pass, and the heavy police presence meant that if you chanced it, you were certain to be caught. Given that the penalty for violating that ordinance would have meant a fine of up to 50,000 dirham, almost £11,000 or $14,000, possible jail time, and if you were an expat, probable deportation, life became limited to the square footage of a one-bedroom flat with no balcony. To be honest, there were quite a few positives in the beginning. No more 50-minute commutes to work, an excuse to binge-watch all the TV I wanted, and the chance to see my then-wife for more than an hour or two at the end of the day. For a while, it was almost like a mini-holiday. Of course, after a couple of weeks, the walls began to close in. Like many others, we started to grasp hold of anything to break up the tedium and lessen the sense of enclosure. Arts and crafts, new recipes, indoor exercise circuits, spring cleaning, online role-playing games. I'm just thankful our entertainment options weren't limited to a wallpapering video and a crochet magazine. Otherwise, one of us would have ended up wearing a gingham dress and talking to a hand puppet named Mr. Flibble. Now, if you don't get that reference, you need to go and find the quarantine episode of the British sitcom Red Dwarf. Trust me, you won't regret it. Anyway, as those of us who went through any lockdown know, it eventually turns into a losing battle. Despite every effort to keep busy and focus on anything besides how long it's going to take for normality to resume, it eventually starts to get to you. Human beings are social creatures. We evolved over millions of years to live and work in cooperative groups, not to sequester ourselves in artificial bubbles tenuously connected by high-speed broadband. Human beings need to feel connected, not just with other people, but with the wider world around them. Anytime that connection is broken, especially for an extended period of time, something inside of us just starts to drift away. Personally, I remember this indistinct and inconspicuous sense of absent detachment that crept in and surreptitiously took over any unclaimed mental space. I wouldn't compare it to depression exactly, but there was definitely something very anhedonic about it that I just couldn't seem to shake off. That was until I turned on YouTube one day and saw an American named Dixie vlogging her thru-hike of the Appalachian Trail. I knew a little about the AT from what I'd read in Bill Bryson's book A Walk in the Woods, but I'd never seen it before, not even when I'd visited Georgia and the Carolinas with my then-wife on one of our trips to see her family down in Florida. I was absolutely entranced, not just by the beauty of the place, but by its scale. Then, for the first time since lockdown began, that sense of noxious enclosure started to crack. By watching those videos, I felt like I was reconnecting with an old friend I'd neglected for far too long, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. When I'd exhausted the videos on Dixie's channel, I searched YouTube for all the hiking videos I could find, until eventually stumbling across Spend More Time in the Wild by Abby Barnes. Unlike most of the channels that I'd previously watched, the majority of the videos here didn't focus on the wide vistas of the American trails or the equally impressive landscapes of our own national parks. Instead, they featured the very countryside I'd grown up in. The other channels had been a lifeline, but Abby's channel brought me home, and the more I watched, the more I missed it. That really surprised me, just how much I missed it. Like a lot of people, I think, I've always had a very complicated relationship with the place I grew up in. So complicated, in fact, that it's the main reason I left to work overseas as soon as I could. As I said earlier, I grew up surrounded by the English countryside, specifically in a small market town in Dorset called Dorchester. If you're not from the UK, you might know it by the name Casterbridge, as it appeared in more than one of the novels written by Thomas Hardy. Despite the comeliness of the surroundings, I can't say that it was a particularly pleasant place to grow up. Given the idealised assumptions we tend to have about small towns, this statement often surprises or even shocks people, and I understand why, I really do. On the one hand, small towns, especially small country towns, are often stunningly beautiful. More often than not, the air is fresh, the streets are clean, and the kids can play outside without having to worry about getting stabbed or finding used needles on the street. Without context suggesting that a place like that proffered your childhood with anything less than Enid Blyton-esque perfection can stink of ingratitude and privilege. It can make you sound like a man complaining that the bag of gold he's been given is too heavy to carry home. The thing is, though, small town life is very much a double-edged sword. Yes, they're pretty, yes, they're clean, and yes, they can be safer places to live than large cities. They're also scaled-up versions of the room that Sartre used to represent hell in his play No Exit. Hell is other people, not just because we have the potential to torture each other, but because the watchful gaze and accompanied judgment of others locks you into a particular way of living and deprives you of the freedom to choose otherwise. In a small town, everyone either knows your business or thinks they do. Furthermore, they're not shy about expressing the judgments they've formed or using them to justify the most callous of behaviours. Plus, they never leave. Hardly anyone moves out and hardly anyone moves in, so moving on from what people have decided they know about you is next to impossible. It's also impossible to escape the implacable hostility that these communities often have towards outsiders. By outsiders, I don't just mean people from outside the community, the region or the country, but anyone who falls outside the accepted cultural norms. All too often the attitude boils down to fit in or fuck off, and if you can't do either, you'll soon learn just how cruel and unwelcoming small communities can really be when they want to. As you can imagine, moving away from that to work overseas was an incredibly liberating experience. It not only gave me the freedom to choose the person that I wanted to be, but also to step out of a box that years of external judgment had placed me in. Conversely, coming back, even for reasonably short periods of time, felt like stepping back into a very uncomfortable cage. So, discovering that I missed it was something of a surprise. It must be said, though, that when I was watching Abby's videos, the ones that I felt most connection with and the areas that I felt the most yearning for were those around Weymouth. Like Dorchester, Weymouth is a smallish Dorset town, but to its credit, it's gloriously deficient in small-town bullshit. If you've ever watched the American comedy Parks and Recreation, you'll understand what I mean when I say that Weymouth is to Dorchester as Pawnee is to Eagleton. I may not have grown up in Weymouth, but I attended the local college when I was doing my A-levels, and in the intervening years a significant proportion of my family has migrated there. So, when I do return to Dorset, it's usually to Weymouth, and it's never a decision I regret. While I have a complicated relationship with many of the places from my childhood, my relationship with Weymouth is much simpler, simply because it's pretty much the only place that's ever truly felt like home. Also, besides having one of the best beaches in the country, a stunningly beautiful Georgian harbour, a vibrant live music scene, and some of the best seafood you'll ever eat, Weymouth also sits right in the middle of one of the most beautiful stretches of the southwest coast path. So, when I started thinking about where I might go to do a little bit of long-distance hiking myself, the SWCP was a natural fit. I'd already done most of the sections around Weymouth as day hikes, and I knew that many of the other sections passed through places I hadn't seen since I was a kid. So, if I was going to do a long-distance hike, it made sense to do the rest of the path. Besides, the paths that we walk don't just connect the individual with nature, they connect the past with the present. Paths exist as passageways through the memories of people and places etched into the countryside that surrounds them. In the words of Robert Macfarlane in his book The Old Ways, they make the past excitingly alive and coexistent, allowing time to fold into itself and bring discontinuous moments of our lives into contact with each other. So, if I was lucky, walking this path might just help me to reconnect with a past I'd actively tried to separate myself from, and maybe even give me the chance to come to terms with some of the stuff that kept me away. Or, failing that, at least enjoy some decent cider along the way.